We find ourselves today reflecting on three interspaces, internecine, the bits in between. The places where people don't hang out. So if you go from Sydney to Melbourne, there's a big gap in the middle, and we think of it as not Sydney and not Melbourne. I mean, I know we call it country New South Wales, and there's a big stretch of really straight road that's country Victoria, but it's essentially not Sydney and not Melbourne because there's not many people there. There's some cattle, some sheep, some petrol stations, some mountains, and probably a capital city in there somewhere like the ACT. This is what it's like to live in a culture. We live in Sydney, we consider Sydney, we think Sydney, we behave Sydney. When I first went to Melbourne as a first year out church army officer, I was greeted by a parish who hadn't yet got their rector in place, and when he arrived he said, "Oh, you're from Sydney." And I was gone 9 months later, well, 6 months after he arrived. He really couldn't cope with someone from Sydney being in his midst, and he didn't even take the time to get to know who I was before he decided that. It was shocking to me that someone would judge me according to what he thought he knew, but it's not surprising because I really knew very little of him either. When we consider people who are different to us, it requires something of us. It costs. There's a price for us considering the other. Now, we've been talking about others for a long time, but the benefit of the lectionary is it keeps on taking us there by different roads. So today the road takes us through Babylon and in between Samaria and Jerusalem and Galilee. In the Old Testament reading, we find Jeremiah speaking to people who are in exile. They are out of town. They are outsiders in their own, outside of their own land. And he says to them, make yourself at home. You're in the space of the other, live with the other. Build homes and live in them. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons, give your daughters in marriage. This includes the possibility of going to outsiders to marry. This is a very new word that Jeremiah brings to these people. When they've been told to stay pure, to stay separate from those around them, Jeremiah is saying, make yourself at home. Become family. Be known to those people. Be fruitful among them. When we go to the gospel reading, we find Jesus walking in the space, somewhere around Yass, walking between Samaria and Galilee. It's a strange space for a kosher Jew to be walking because it takes him into the vicinity of people like lepers. Now, having gone through COVID, we understand a little bit of what it's like to be lepers, being perpetually assumed to be unclean is a difficult place to live. We're not Melbourne, so we don't know really what it's like to be locked down, but thank God for that. But there is some careful storytelling in this passage that I want to invite you to notice. Firstly, that he tells us that they're in the region between Samaria and Galilee. He didn't just say Jesus was walking from Samaria to Galilee or Galilee to Samaria. He said he was in the region between. This is the place where people who are outcast can live. So when we go out from the place where we're comfortable, we find ourselves coming into contact with people who are uncomfortable. They call out, they know who he is, so they've been paying attention. The people on the outside can see what's happening inside. But they kept their distance because they're polite and they know what 1.5 metres looks like, right? When he saw them, he heard them. They saw him, so they called out, and he heard them. But it says when he saw them. Did Jesus need glasses? Is there a problem with his eyesight that lepers could see him but he couldn't see them? Or maybe he smelled so they knew he was coming. Why do you think the gospel writer says when he saw them? I think the gospel writer is intending to notice that Jesus paid what Esther would call loving regard to these people. I don't want to just assume. When I say Esther, I mean my philosopher friend from America, right? This loving regard, this noticing of the people, sees who they are and says that you are valuable. Says, I notice you and I give you value by my noticing. He notices them and says, go. This steps into a really tricky space because the whole point of going to the priests for a leper to be made clean is that it's to protect the community from leprosy. Just like we were being protected from COVID, just like Dictator Dan in Melbourne was keeping Victoria safe by keeping everyone locked down and you know, people cried out in the injustice. But the concern is for our welfare. Jesus says, go and do what the system says you need to do in order to be well. But in the noticing of that, in the noticing of them, in the location that we find them, there's also a critique of the system that causes them to be outcast. The reason they're in the intermediate space, the reason they're not in the town, the reason they're not in community, the reason they're in this haphazard group of people from Samaria and Galilee is that the system locks them out, causes them to be other. This is why Luke is saying to us, pay attention, go to the place where they are. If we're to follow Jesus on the way, we need to go to the place in between. Now, I'm not saying go to Goulburn and hang out at the big Merino. What I am saying is that we have lots of in-between places in our lives. And we often see ourselves on the way as an inconvenient waste of time where I could be at one place or the other, but I'm in the between space. He says, go and show yourselves to the priest, and as they went, they were made clean. And so it is for us as we go on the way, following Jesus, in the spaces in between, in the wasted moments between being where we are and where we want to be, we find ourselves as disciples practicing what it looks like to be present, offering noticing regard to the people that we come across haphazardly. Now, the Sunday school version of this story focuses on the next bit. One guy turned back when he realised he was made well and said thank you. It's coming up to Thanksgiving time in America next month. And this is the story that's read out because we need to give thanks. It is important to notice that the one who was an outsider turned back to give thanks, not the ones who were insiders. So it's really easy for us as insiders to take God's grace for granted and not be continually offering gratitude. But I suspect this is not the main point of the story. This is not what Luke is calling us to, but rather to that recognizing that the inequity caused by the law, the system that locks people out, is made to be undone. Jeremiah sharpens it and says, go and live there. Make your home there. Be at home. And we did that, and it was fruitful. Home is a comfortable space. Home is a place of hospitality. We could call this our spiritual home because we have the table and we offer hospitality. And last night, it was a great privilege to offer hospitality to people, many of whom have never gone to church, but found themselves welcome here. But it's not good enough for us to wait for them to come to us, or even call them to come to us, because Jeremiah and Luke are both saying, make your home in the other place, in the place with the other. Jesus sends him on his way and says, get up and go on your way. These are code words. On your way, on the way, as they went. They're code words, and Luke uses those codes 3 times in the passage. This is a discipleship story. This is about us being on the way. Certainly gratitude is at the core, but the story is about unravelling unjust systems that keep people tied up and tied out, locked out. And our invitation is to pursue hospitality, to be the people who go to the places where people are locked out and invite them home by making our home with them, by being present with them, by offering our loving regard to them.